Angels of Sodom by Maye. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Genesis 19:24-25. For those who have taken my secrets to their graves. 1. New and tender. Dust. The two angels built their bodies from dust. They descended in the early evening, their radiance casting stark shadows across the barren wastes. They sculpted their new forms in a small desert canyon, far from prying eyes. This was kindness. Mortals who gazed upon the pure light of their heavenly forms would be struck blind. The Archon had commanded them to disguise themselves, to hide inside the flesh of a man and a woman, so that they could safely wander to and fro upon the earth. Between the steep hillsides they boiled dust, and tore apart the air, and shattered rocks to release steam. Twin whirlwinds of flame formed as new substances were fused from the fractured water, earth, and air. Bones hardened, creating a frame for the entrails, gonads, and muscles. Blood surged through tangled arteries as their new and tender hearts began to beat. Flesh crept across the growing mass, bloody and raw, gelatinous and quivering. Inch by inch, the newborn skin shifted from pale pinks to darker tones. Fine hairs slid from fresh follicles, thickening, growing black and curled. Haliel, the angel of flowers, took her first breath. She cried out when the inferno air seared her virgin lungs, her eyes forced wide. She found Apidolon, the angel of bees, standing near her, though not for long. His own first breath was quickly released as a shriek. His knees buckled and his shriek became a howl. The baked dust had become black glass, blistering hot. He seemed to have no control over his body as he rolled back and forth, his legs kicking. Spit, snot, and tears sizzled on the crackling earth around his head. In what appeared to be his first deliberate movement, he drew his hand toward his face. His cries faded to silence as he stared at his fingers in undisguised horror. Haliel kept her legs beneath her, even though her own feet were blistered and burnt. It wasn't courage that held her erect, but fear. The black grass cracked all around her as it cooled, with sharp, jagged edges forming in an ever-expanding web. Apidolon bled from countless crisscross cuts. She stood as still as possible to avoid this fate. Watching Apidolon writhe, whimpering and bleeding, stirred a new emotion within her. Her nose wrinkled with disgust at Apidolon's weakness. How odd that her face should move without her conscious command. Fear and disgust were emotions she'd never experienced in the ceaseless eternity that preceded this moment. The Archon had told them that, once embodied, the brain would be the seat of all thought, but this disgust felt visceral. Somewhere deep in her gut, she was ashamed of Apidolon, and judged him for not bearing his fate with more grace. Him. He. His. How odd! Until this moment, both angels had been sexless. Sex existed for reproduction, and angels had no need to make more angels. They'd always been, and would always be. They didn't even possess the words to express these ideas. They communicated on a level far beyond anything as crude as speech. But the Archon had known what tools they'd need to pass unnoticed in the realms of men, and their newly minted brains were overstuffed with nouns and pronouns, verbs and adverbs. Their once boundless understanding had been shackled by the limits of language. Yet, there was something novel, almost exciting, happening within her skull as she placed a hand upon her belly and discovered she knew the words for hand and belly. Her skin was soft, smooth as a rose petal, and it thrilled her to know the words rose and petal. For countless centuries, she'd held dominion over the floral realm. Her imagination had colored and shaped the generative organs of flowers into new forms over the workings of 10,000 generations. Roses were her handiwork, as were violets, lilacs, marigolds, and 10,000 more. Until this moment, she'd never known that they'd been given names. Her fingers continued exploring. The pain of her burnt feet faded as she studied her flesh. Beneath her skin, she felt a thin layer of fat, and below this, muscle, rigid, almost stony, from the effort of keeping her standing. Beneath the muscles, bowels. The heart and lungs would be above them. Below would be a womb. Her womb. As she thought of the hidden organs, she could sense them. They were communicating with constant, silent signals, as coordinated and complex as the angelic melodies that eternally echoed through heaven. The activity of her viscera bewildered her. She felt certain that it was her guts stirring her displeasure toward Apidolon's undignified writhing. To feel disgust in the pit of her stomach, rather than have it centered in her brain, made her question if her new body was somehow malformed. She frowned, feeling the muscles of her face, aware of her lips sliding along her teeth. Teeth? How bizarre! Her belly was silken and her feet so tender. In contrast, her mouth contained twin ridges of tiny, hard, sharp rocks. Monstrous! But also interesting. An angel was only ever one thing, existing for a single purpose. But a body was so many things, with so many uses. Why did her fingers have nails? What purpose did they serve? Why was her scalp covered in such long, thick black hair, while the rest of her flesh was covered in fine, almost invisible hairs, save for her armpits and her crotch, which was hidden beneath a bush of dark curls? The mysteries of her new body might have held her to the same spot for untold hours if she hadn't been drawn from her reverie by a foul odor. In his thrashing agony, Apidolon had lost control of his bladder. The fluid hissed against the baked sands. The stench of boiling urine made her eyes water. "Enough," she said. This was the first word she'd ever spoken. Her tongue and lips and lungs had all worked in unison to convey her thought, and she was surprised that such a complex coordination of her various body parts could occur without any conscious thought. "We'll never finish our mission if you spend all your time here weeping and befouling yourself. Rise." "How are you even standing?" Apidolon said, between gasps. "I'm heavy, so heavy." "You have muscles. Use them." She could hear the contempt in her words, and it struck her that her voice was strangely naked. The word didn't quite fit. The subtleties of language might take a long time to master. She would have liked to spend hours sorting through the disordered dictionaries that filled her new brain, but she knew there was no time. Sunset was drawing near, and they had to complete their mission before the following dawn. For a being used to eternal timescales, the feeling of seconds rapidly passing was unpleasant, and her disgust over Apidolon's weakness refined itself into anger that he was wasting her time. As her anger grew, she once more suspected her entrails were guiding her thoughts in ways she couldn't quite control. On some primal level, she felt that, as a woman, it was unsettling to see a man weeping from physical discomfort. Were her own feet not blistered? Did the pull of the earth not test her muscles with the same unyielding force? When Apidolon failed to rise, new words came to her lips. "You're embarrassing yourself. Be a man." Apidolon looked as if she'd slapped him. Gritting his teeth, he breathed loudly through his snotty nose as he rolled to his belly, then rose onto his hands and knees. Fine shards of glass jutted from his bloodied skin, and sweat dripped from every pore. He stood on wobbling legs, drawing to his full height. Haliel gazed up at his face. He seemed to loom over her like a tower, though, at best, he was perhaps 8 inches taller. It was more than his extra height that gave the impression she was standing next to some formidable structure. Now that he wasn't flopping pathetically in the dust, Apidolon's muscles looked like smooth stones beneath his dark skin. When his thick legs stopped trembling, they looked as sturdy as tree trunks. He drew his shoulders back as he took a deep, calming breath. His broad chest was so much more massive than her own, even though she was the one ordained with somewhat heavy breasts. Given his extra mass, perhaps she could forgive him for being more susceptible to the pull of gravity than herself. His nose wrinkled. This animal stench. Is it. Is this stink coming from me? This shouldn't surprise you. We are animals, at least until dawn. As she spoke, his eyes fixed upon her face, but not for long. With almost comical intensity, his gaze dropped to her naked breasts, then to the dark curls hiding her pubic mound. His pupils dilated, his nostrils twitched, and there was a slight whistling noise as he purposefully drew air through them. You. You smell pleasant. For an animal. So it seems, she said, glancing at his lower belly. On the ground, when he'd been peeing himself, his cock had been little more than a nub of flesh, a small, floppy finger jutting from the tangled hair that covered his crotch. Now this little finger was rising, lengthening and growing thicker. Skin peeled back from the head to reveal a pink knob with a small slit at the tip. A dewdrop of moisture sat atop this tiny divot of flesh. Some remnant of the urine? Some other bodily fluid? Haliel couldn't explain why this should interest her at all, but she also found she couldn't turn her eyes away. Her cheeks grew hot, but not because of the radiant heat of the seared soil. It's unfair, Apidolon grumbled, as his eyes remained glued on her crotch. I wet myself, and the odor is hideous. You wet yourself and somehow smell even better. Wet herself? Instinctively, her hand fell between her legs. Her mouth opened slightly. She was wet. The interior of both her thighs were slick with moisture. Most of this was sweat from the heat, but her fingers swiftly discovered drops of a thicker, slicker fluid that coated her pubic hair. As the Angel of Flowers, she recognized something familiar happening, something she hadn't known human bodies could do. She was blooming. Small folds of flesh between her legs were opening, unfurling, coming to life. Her cunt was awakening, and the moisture seeping from it wasn't urine, but something more akin to nectar. She brought her wet fingers toward her nose and sniffed them. The scent was predominantly brine, but with floral notes. Without her willing it, her tongue snaked between her lips and tasted the moisture. Salt. Incense. Honey. This first taste awakened her previously innocent tongue. She was suddenly ravenous, feeling like she could grab fistfuls of the baked soil around her to shove into her mouth. Then her hunger sharpened, growing more defined, and she cast her needful gaze upon Apidolon. She wanted to taste the sweat that coated his face, and to trace the tip of her tongue along the inviting skin of his lips. The sensations and images flooding her mind jolted her, making her tremble. Apidolon saw the turmoil written upon her face. Are you in distress? I don't know, she whispered. My heart is racing. My breaths are faster. She started to tell him she was hot, but now the heat felt more like a chill, and the sensation confounded her. I may have a fever. It isn't unpleasant. I don't dislike what I'm feeling. He tilted his head, giving her a quizzical look. She struggled against the confusion of her senses. Until this point, words had sprung freely to her lips, but now it felt like words were fleeing her. I feel good? Only better than good. She swallowed. Her mouth had become overly filled with saliva. Your new form pleases me, Epidlon. I find your scent desirable. I would I would like to touch you. And I would like for you to touch me. Epidlon tilted back his head and roared with laughter. Why are you laughing? Look at you, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. You've worn flesh for 5 minutes, and you're already mewling like a cat in heat. Me? She protested, directing her eyes once more to his cock. It was fully engorged now, jutting up at an angle. It was slightly curved, covered in thick veins, and looked longer than her hand. She decided to measure the true size of this curious object, lifting her fingers toward it, but Epidlon caught her by the wrist. She tried to pull her arm away, but he held on. She tried again, pulling harder, but couldn't free herself. How was he so much stronger than she was? Now he was the one with contempt in his eyes. She felt utterly naked before him, which she was, but her previously innocent nudity had become vulgar and shameful, as her flesh openly betrayed her deepest desires. Her nipples were puckered and hard. Her cheeks were red and burning. Her cunt was a fountain. Trickles of her nectar ran all the way to her knees. Your animal lusts have overwhelmed you, he said, his tone balanced between amusement and scorn. You've lost control of yourself. Perhaps you should control me, she said, her voice deep and raspy. She closed her eyes and tilted her face upward to meet his. Her lips parted. If there was any order in the universe, any sense at all in creation, his lips would now meet hers. But she was only met with another laugh. She opened her eyes as he let go of her arm. Come, he said. We've work to do. Of course, she whispered, feeling something within her wither at his rejection. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have allowed these sensations to distract me. Don't apologize, he said. It's not truly your fault. The Archon has given us the typical forms of a man and woman, along with the extraneous body parts built into these shapes. I can't imagine how these distracting organs will be of any use at all for our mission. He dropped his hand to his crotch. Taking hold of his penis, he pushed, then tucked. With his other hand, he covered his ugly, dangling testicles and pressed forward. When he pulled his hands away, there was only a slight bulge visible beneath the kinky hair. Matter obeys spirit. We can improve upon our designs as needed. To prove his point, the hundreds of cuts that marred his flesh instantly scabbed over. He shook himself and the scabs fell away, revealing unblemished flesh. You're right, she said. I was simply caught off guard by novel sensations. It won't happen again. She cupped her breasts. She unconsciously paused to judge them. They were the breasts of a female well past girlhood, but still firm, perhaps too firm, since gravity hadn't had years to draw them downward. Taking her erect nipples between her fingers, she permitted herself a final moment of tempting pleasure as she applied slight pressure to them. With a thought, they went flaccid, retreating into her body slightly as she stilled the animal urges that had stirred them to attention. More cautiously, she slipped a hand between her legs. She knew she needed to close the flower that had blossomed there, but for a moment She couldn't resist the temptation to explore it with her fingertips. She traced the outer reaches of her labia. Such an intriguing shape. In her dominion over flowers, she'd worked over generations to alter the delicate curves of the different petals to better attract insects and birds that would transport pollen from bloom to bloom. Her own opened petals parted with ease beneath her fingers, seeming to invite them in. She was curious about the forces that had shaped the flesh between a woman's legs, and wished that she had time to explore her cunt more thoroughly. "Why do you delay?" asked Epidolon. My anatomy is more complicated than yours. I don't want to eliminate a body part I might need later. "Come morning, we'll leave this flesh behind forever," said Epidolon. "There's nothing down there you'll need in the intervening hours." Her jaw tightened. He was right. She didn't need any of this extra tissue. She pulled her fingertip from between her labia. She covered the whole of her sex with her hand. There was a moment of discomfort as she willed the flesh to rearrange itself. When she pulled her hand away, the gap between her legs was as barren as the ground they stood upon. She brought her hand to her face. With a thought, the glistening moisture that covered her fingers turned to dust, which drifted away on the breeze. "There," said Epidolon. "You should be able to think clearly now." "Agreed," said Haliel, careful not to meet his gaze. For the first time in eternity, she'd lied. He'd only laugh at her again if she confessed that she was still unsettled. The fire that had ignited within her continued to smolder, and she'd removed all possibility of physical release. We should focus on the mission. Which way to the city? Epidolon scanned the hillsides. Night was coming on. Without a word, he set off, climbing one of the hills, motioning for Haliel to follow. Even after they left behind the burnt and broken glass that marked the spot of their arrival, the desert soil was nothing but lifeless dust and crumbling rock. This was no place for flowers or bees. How could there be any men surviving in this desolate heat, let alone an entire city? "There," said Epidolon, at the crest of the hill. He pointed toward the west. She reached his side. In the far distance was a vast stretch of dark water, an inland sea. Between the hillside they stood upon and this distant sea were acre after acre of green squares, laid out in a grid of irrigation canals. The green lands held crops and orchards. The angelic essence hidden within her flesh hummed as it felt the presence of innumerable flowers among these gardens. Epidolon had a faint smile. It was a different expression than the one he'd worn when he'd laughed at her. That smile had mocked her, but this smile filled her with warmth. "Bees," he said. "Millions of them." They were both so distracted by the thriving farmlands that it took Haliel a moment to realize that there was, in fact, a vast and bustling city along the water's shore. In the fading sunlight, the curved walls and high towers of the city took on a pinkish hue. For a place so vile as to deserve utter destruction, the city looked warm and inviting. "Sodom," she said. "It looks very distant. It will take us half the night to walk there." "Why would we walk?" he asked, turning his back to her. Twin humps atop his shoulder blades bulged, writhed, then burst, giving birth to wings that opened wide, then wider still, dazzling her with the whiteness of their feathers.